see it, just let me know if everyone can see that.
Beautiful. Yeah,
okay,
we can
great.
see that.
Lovely. Okay, so just going to bring you through a very quick update on what's happening throughout sustainable finance markets. So that includes covering the GSSS plus bond market. So that would include green, social sustainability, and sustainability linked bonds. So we've definitely seen, quite a varied interest in GSSS plus bonds over the years. So we saw the peak actually in 2021 in terms of issuances with a total of close to $1.1 trillion. We then saw a bit of a pullback in 2022 with a slight rebound in 2023, but obviously we are also working against more, I guess, unfavorable negative macroeconomic backdrop at the moment. So this year, unfortunately, we don't have all the data, but year to date, we have seen a little bit of a strong start to 2024. Actually, in January, we saw a record green bond issuance of about close to 85 US billion. And in February, close to about $55 billion in terms of issuances. And the industry projections for the whole year in terms of the entire sustainable finance market, it's actually within the range of 850 billion to about $1 trillion US. So quite a healthy market, but obviously it's still quite dwarfed by the plain vanilla market when you talk about total bond issuances globally. So we definitely saw steady year-on-year growth in the APAC and Latin American markets, as you can see on the graph on the left. So it definitely is dwarfing the North American as well as the basically the North American market, but EMEA as a region has always traditionally been more active when it comes to ESG labeled bond issuances. Obviously, they were the first market, I guess, in the world to kind of really pioneer progress in the space with the EU taxonomy. So naturally, they have still remained relatively strong. But again, across all markets, we are seeing some challenges in terms of headwinds this year with regard to everybody watching the US Federal Reserve for rate cuts and what that might mean for the larger financial markets. So we'll stay tuned and obviously keep you updated with regard to our research as time goes on. What we saw in 2023 was that corporate as well as financial institutions were the largest issuers and really drove the growth in terms of issuances across the label bond market. So that would include green, social sustainability, and sustainability linked. But primarily the bulk of that would actually be from green bond issuances. All right, and this would actually be kind of going a bit more into the individual categories of what constitutes GSSS plus. So with regard to the green bonds, we definitely saw quite a large number of, at least what we rated in terms of Sustainable Fitch, the green bond use of proceeds. A lot of the use of proceeds were actually dedicated to renewable energy as well as energy efficiency in terms of where the funding was going and what companies were saying that the funding was going to be going to. So that takes up an outsized portions. Obviously, smaller amounts go to clean transportation and green buildings, as well as water management, as you can see from that pie chart on the left. I think we have seen this throughout the years be the case. Naturally, a lot of the promised use of proceeds actually go towards some kind of energy efficiency or energy use, basically, in terms of when it comes to climate mitigation measures. And the graph on the right that you see is actually based on our UOP scores. So we have our own framework in terms of what we rate when we look at the use of proceeds for individual bond issuances and what the pledges mean. So one would actually indicate an excellent score. So as you can see, most of them are quite average at about 2, with a couple of them renewable energy and clean transportation at 1. The next would actually be social bonds. So, sorry, 1 second, my screen just blanked out on me. Okay, good. With social bonds, we saw the use of proceeds really be directed towards affordable housing as well as socioeconomic advancement. So that can mean many things across many countries, particularly for emerging markets. That can mean educational efforts, job upskilling, just to basically help the whole of economy kind of move up when it comes to social welfare. So that was a large part of what we saw with regard to use of proceeds. And once again, in terms of the average social bond UOP score by activity type, you can see that we gave food security, affordable basic infrastructure, socioeconomic advancement a score of 2, with affordable housing and employment generation getting a score of 1, meaning that it was an excellent score. Okay, got my slide moved. Okay, good. All right, and then in terms of some activities that we're seeing be underfunded, really when it comes to analysis, what we have seen is that a lot of the financing has gone towards climate mitigation rather than adaptation over the years. As you can see by the skewed chart on your screen, climate adaptation has gotten the least number of issuances with regard to what they pledge in terms of UOPs. It really shows that categories like pollution prevention, employment generation, and climate adaptation, despite being some of these very key components of a lot of the sectors like real estate, construction, manufacturing, unfortunately, they are not getting as much in terms of funding when it comes to bond issuances. And like I said earlier, really, it's all very much skewed towards mitigation over adaptation. So with the label bond market, we see that it's providing limited financing to these adaptation activities to manage really outsized climate change situations, especially if you're in a region such as Southeast Asia, which is very exposed to, unfortunately, climate change issues with regard to, extreme weather conditions or any kind of destruction that can come from that. So really, there is a huge funding gap that is estimated to be between 160 billion to 340 billion per year up until 2030. So we really think that the lack of focus on adaptation and resilience really constitutes a very big risk, both with regard to physical climate risk as well as also obviously financial risks for people who are issuing or not issuing with regard to UOPs. Next, I'm going to bring you through some key trends that we expect to see for 2024. We actually did a big report on this at the start of the year, but we see that a lot of these still hold true, even at the halfway point of this year. So the first would actually be that a growing scope of sectors are actually starting to access sustainable financing in order to try and shore up the funding that they need to finance their activities and obviously transition over to, I guess, more green or sustainable business operations. So currently, we see that the use of proceeds for bonds really finance a small amount of activities. So 65% of green bond UOPs really go towards renewables, energy efficiency, and clean transport, which as I probably saw earlier in the slide. We are also seeing a growing number of sectors really try to issue labeled debt. So that would constitute things like agriculture, food, steel shipping, manufacturing. And we expect a shift from, driven by the investors away from divestment, which was their previous strategy, more towards engaging and trying to engage in transition strategies, especially for hard to abate sectors. And on the social front, we also think that healthcare projects will likely gain momentum, especially coming off the post-COVID season. I think, a lot of infrastructure is still needed there and development on that front. The next thing that we're observing, or that we expect, would be that innovation is really increasing financing to underfunded projects as well as countries, especially in emerging markets. Again, Candace and I sit in Singapore. Fortunately, we are on, I guess, the higher end of that emerging market spectrum, but with regard to other countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, parts of China, I think that tends to be something that is overlooked. So one of the main goals of broadening the scope of sustainable finance is really to help channel more financing towards these emerging markets. And that is something that we are seeing. It started probably towards last year. We're seeing that continue through this year, where a lot more countries are issuing at the sovereign level, as well as companies that are within those countries issue labeled debt. And we think that these markets are characterized just by the large presence of hard to abate sectors, especially, within Asia, especially. There are large sectors that are very heavily reliant on coal and fossil fuels. So we are starting to see a lot more companies tap the sustainable finance market in order to try and help finance the transition over to cleaner or renewable energies. Great. And then we also see more investors are starting to explore new types of labeled bonds. So obviously I mentioned earlier that there was green, social sustainability, and sustainability linked, but obviously under those umbrellas as well, we are seeing more interest in more niche areas of the market, such as blue bonds, orange bonds, and transition bonds. So for those who are not familiar, blue bonds would actually tackle anything to do with water or the oceans. Orange bonds tackle social issues, and transition bonds really, unfortunately, there is no globally agreed upon definition, but these tend to be issued with regard to trying to raise funding to transition, supply chains or operational models over to, I guess, greener or more sustainable energy efficient processes. So that's something that we see developing through this year. Countries such as the Philippines have actually created their own guidebooks and frameworks with regard to things like blue bonds. So we're seeing the infrastructure and the frameworks in terms of support really be developed, and we expect more of these issuances going forward. But we still, obviously, in the context of the greater GSSS plus market, we still see this as being quite a niche specialty area. Obviously, also with the new frameworks that are arising around the world, that's going to lead to increased scrutiny. So with more sophisticated frameworks and structures that are launched, we also see that we are likely to see a bit more investor scrutiny with regard to transactions such as debt for nature swaps, issuances from peer players, and also newer SLB structures. As we know, SLBs, short for sustainability-linked bonds, have obviously faced a credibility issue as well. So we think that these frameworks, while they've been developed, will still remain the exception rather than the norm. There will still be a lot of debate around what is acceptable and what needs to be communicated to the market as well as investors in terms of what is going to be kosher and what can be really applied when you're looking at investments and raising funding. We also see actually a growing range of issuers accessing the transition market. So as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, with regard to the definition of transition, it is still not a globally agreed upon definition. It's not like green or social bonds. There's still a lot of debate going on with regard to what can be considered transition. So historically, what we saw is energy companies were really the primary issuers of transition bonds. But obviously, with the poor labeling and the poor definition of this, we are seeing more companies try their best to come up with instruments that are aligned, but just because there is no one set framework or definition, that can be quite difficult for companies that are issuing, especially if you don't want to be accused of greenwashing or transition washing. But again, like I said, we do see that this market is really growing beyond traditional sectors, from energy to other sectors as well. And the new standards that are coming out, there are a few that have been issued, or at least a few approaches that have emerged in terms of defining transition finance. We think that will lead to the continued expansion and scaling of this particular part of the market. So for example, the ICMA in 2023 issued their Climate Transition Finance Handbook. That is something that the market has really looked to. Obviously, the ICMA has published other handbooks with regard to green, social, sustainability instruments, and that has been really the standard for what the market looks at. But with regard to the climate transition finance, I think there has been quite heavy debate in terms of what they define to be transition. But with regard to standards and frameworks, that's not the only approach. Other countries, such as the one we're in, Singapore, they have issued a taxonomy that accounts for transition factors. So the Singapore Asia taxonomy was actually issued at the end of last year, and that so far has been the most comprehensive approach to tackling transition, especially covering more sectors than a traditional taxonomy would have, and ones that are not covered in the EU taxonomy, just because that does not really account for coal. So I think it's been very encouraging, especially from a research standpoint, to see all these developments come to fore. We are seeing more countries in the region, like Australia, like other Southeast Asian countries, China, Hong Kong, try and take on this approach as well of integrating transition within their existing frameworks and helping industries, eventually convert or progress towards greener operations. So obviously, with all these common guidelines that are coming out, it will really enable the further scaling of this particular part of the market with additional sectors and issuers being accounted for. Something that was very important, and I think a landmark that happened, was towards the end of last year, the government of Japan, and the country has actually very heavily been pushing transition finance as a means for scaling funding that is needed to help transition industries over. The government actually issued over $10 billion worth of bonds under its own transition finance framework. The market was very, very heavily looking towards that, very keenly looking towards that, to see how it performed. Again, purely because there is no set, but the Japanese government is really pushing their way forward and doing their best to carve out their own path for what they see is suitable for their own economy. So we really do think that we'll see transition finance grow as a topic of interest in the coming years, especially as it becomes clear what can be defined under that broad term of transition for hard-to-abate sectors and industries. We also see that biodiversity is really a growing focus for issuers in the market. So as you can see on the chart on the left, you've seen a real increase, almost right straight up, in terms of the number of issuances. It's really doubled in the past several years. Actually, more than doubled. Excuse me, it's more than doubled. So that can constitute anything from conservation topics to replenishing. sort of replenishing what has been lost or preserving what is already in place. So this, is something that we're seeing emerge a lot more in the use of proceeds for a lot of these bonds that are issued. And nature is just really a very broad theme that runs throughout a lot of the categories. So some of those would actually constitute terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity. So that would be with regard to the oceans, your rivers, your water bodies that are significant and vast and hold a lot of resources. The other would be implementing environmentally sustainable management practices of living natural resources. And then the other two would actually be pollution prevention and control, as well as sustainable water management. So as you can see, a common thread here is actually water. So with blue bonds, sustainable water management, terrestrial and aquatic biodiversity, there really is a huge emphasis. And I would say this has emerged very clearly over the past 6 to 8 months. That's something that we have observed when we have been assessing a lot of the UOPs that come out from these bonds. And lastly, before I hand over to Candice, something that we are also observing and that we think will continue to be a theme throughout this year and maybe well into next would be the increasing focus on sustainability-linked bonds credibility. So obviously when the SLB instrument was first brought to market, it was touted as a very revolutionary instrument just because of the flexibility that it would allow for a lot of companies to tap on sustainable finance markets, because the parameters were not as strict as something that as what would have been in the green or sustainability linked bond arena. But unfortunately, we have seen cases of companies, saying that a lot of the funding that will be raised, the use of proceeds, just don't match the core activity that the company might be invested in or engaged in. So, there is a mismatch in terms of the actual impact of the funding that is being raised and where it's being funneled. So that kind of led to a bit of a fallout within the SLB market over the past 1 to 2 years since its launch. And it's really just something that I think both investors from the corporate side as well as FIs and sovereigns have been very wary of before engaging. But we are seeing renewed interest coming back. We are seeing companies starting themselves to actually audit themselves before they put out these sort of instruments and making sure that it is aligned and they can back up the use of proceeds and that it's not greenwashing. So obviously, I think the scrutiny will continue throughout the rest of the time until we see a bit more maturity in the market. So something that I guess a lot of people were looking at initially was Enel. So that was a European energy company. They were the issuer of the first SLB in 2019. And unfortunately, they missed their key emissions reduction target in late 2023. So as you know, with SLBs, if you have missed a target, most companies would pledge to increase the step up of your coupon. So they had to do that. But obviously, because of the whole hubbub that Enel created with regard to when they first came to market with the instrument, everybody was very excited about it. And since they have missed their emissions reduction target, that has kind of dented consumer confidence, investor confidence, as well as market confidence in the product. So hopefully as a couple of years pass, we will see more of these bonds that were issued come to maturity, and hopefully we'll see a lot more alignment and better calibration with regard to the UOPs and KPIs of these bonds. So with that, I'm going to end my section. I'm going to hand over to Candice to take you through the rest. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so she can share her screen with you.
Okay, thank you so much, Melissa. Before you go, let's ask if anyone has any question, please ask right now, because if we go on to the next presentation, you might forget about your question. So when you ask your question, please state your name and company and make it short, please.
That's fine. Even if the question comes to at the end, I can take the question too. It's no problem.
All right. All right. Let's move on to Candice right now.
Yeah. Can everyone see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is basically zoom in a bit from the overview that Melissa has given us. And just to set a bit of context for why we're doing this presentation today. So Melissa focuses on the research side, and then I'm part of the ESG ratings team in Sustainable Fitch. So what we do is we actually produce the ESG ratings, and we do it at 2 levels. So one is on the entity level, which you see on the right-hand side of your screen. There we're looking on the basis of the whole company's operations and business activities. And then we also perform ESG ratings at the debt instrument level. So this is what I'll be focusing on today. And the way that we do our analysis, it differs depending on the type of labeled bond. So either it's a use of proceeds bond, which is the GSS, Green Social Sustainability that you see there, or it's a KPI linked bond. And we produce framework ratings, and also we use a very, very similar methodology to produce second-party opinions. So the examples that I will show you will be from our second-party opinions that we've done in the past few years. And yeah, let me just move on. So to give you an idea of what we look at when we're performing our second-party opinions, we're looking at alignment with the ICMA principles, as well as alignment with best practices. So I'll refer to ICMA principles, but basically we're also referring to the Loan Market Association principles for loans. So those are very, very similar, right? Except some differences in the reporting, because for loans, the reporting is not expected to be public. But basically, the underlying principles are very similar. And the point I want to make here is that the ICMA principles are the most widely used reference for the labeled bond market. So here we have a chart showing, based on all the framework ratings that we have done, the percentage of bonds that we've assessed to be aligned with ICMA principles. So you can see for use of proceeds bond, it's nearly 100%. For KPI linked, there's a significantly higher share of bonds that we assess to be not aligned, not fully aligned. For various reasons, I think some of the key reasons are the lack of target ambition and the failure to adhere to the reporting and verification requirements. And later on, I'll talk a bit about the reasons for the KPI linked, the principles underpinning those, and you can understand a bit more why it's a bit difficult to fully align. So so first of all, I'll talk about the principles for use of proceeds bonds. So there are 4 pillars, and these apply to green, social, and sustainability bonds. So for sustainability bonds, it's basically a combination where you have use of proceeds that are green and use of proceeds that are social. So the first pillar is the use of proceeds, and this is, it underpins the whole concept of a green, social, sustainable bond. So basically, you're defining projects that the proceeds can be used towards, and these projects should have very clear and direct environmental social benefits. And then in terms of financing versus refinancing, what ICMA requires is that, or recommends, is that issuers disclose their expected share of new financing or refinancing. Not everyone does this. Sometimes they have an expected share stated in the framework, but more often than not, it's reported in the allocation reporting, so post-issuance. And then in terms of when there's refinancing taking place, ICMA also recommends that the look-back period be disclosed. So the idea here is that we're looking at that additionality that the bond brings in terms of bringing on stream new environmental or social projects. And then the second pillar on project evaluation and selection, here we're looking at the governance process around how eligible projects are selected and approved. From the Sustainable Fitch point of view, what we look at are things like the mix of expertise that's involved. So not just purely, treasury or finance functions, but also some sort of ESG related expertise involved. We would view that positively. And then also looking at a clear segregation of responsibilities in terms of who proposes the projects and who approves the projects, so that there's some measure of checks and balances there. And in the ICMA principles, they also talk about transparency around how the issuer intends to manage any environmental or social risks associated with the project. So often in the framework, you will see that there is a list of exclusions that are specified. Or, if it's a bank and already has an existing exclusion list, it will cite that to provide assurance that proceeds are not used towards any environmentally or socially harmful projects. So the third pillar is a management of proceeds. And here, what the IGMA principles require is some transparency about how proceeds are managed and how unallocated proceeds are managed. And in terms of when we do our second-party opinions, what we view the most positively if there is a high degree of separation of the proceeds from the labeled instrument versus general corporate funds. And then in terms of the unallocated proceeds, what we view as best practice, which is honestly not very common in the market, is investing those proceeds in line with the green or social aims of the framework. But most of the time, the most common way of holding unallocated proceeds would be just as general liquidity. And then in terms of reporting, which is the last pillar here, what IGMA requires is annual reporting until full allocation, and in the case of material development. So this is reporting on allocation as well as on impact. And in some cases, companies will commit to reporting until maturity, so that we see as providing the most amount of transparency over the whole life of the instrument. And then when we do our second-party opinions, we also look at the level of granularity of the intended reporting. So it can be done, at the category level, it can be done at the bond level, it can be done at the project level, and those will offer differing levels of transparency into the actual impacts arising from the environmental or social projects. And external verification, you will see mentioned under both the third and fourth pillar. It's recommended, but not required. And this is a difference because later on, when we go to the SLB pillars, you'll see that it's actually required for SLB to assure the credibility. So how we carry out SPOs, we basically follow the IGMA pillars. So those 4 pillars, but we split up the UOP into two sections. And then you can see that in terms of the weightage of the scoring, the UOPs account for the greatest share, so 50%. So that's the real driver of the score. And then how we rate the UOPs, it's on a scale of 1 to 5. So for each UOP, we would look in detail and assign a 1 to 5 score. So 1 to 3, we would still consider that in the positive range, and anything below 3 is in the negative range. So for environmental, basically, we're looking at things like alignment with net zero goals. We're looking at how it compares to international science-based taxonomies. On the social side, we're looking at the contributions to SDGs. And a very key part of the analysis is also looking at how it benefits vulnerable target populations. So these are some of the common green bond UOPs in line with what Melissa showed us just now. So just wanted to show some examples of eligibility criteria, just very briefly described here. But the point I want to make is that you can see for a lot of these, there are quantitative, widely accepted metrics. So like, life cycle emission threshold for renewable energy or percentage of energy or water savings. In some cases, certifications are also used as a way to determine eligibility. So for green buildings, as well as for the environmentally sustainable management of living resources, living natural resources and land use. Very long name, but basically that can refer to projects in agriculture and in afforestation, reforestation that you see here. So typically for those, we might see certifications being used. So when we do our analysis, we will also investigate the rigor of those certifications and the credibility of those certifications in order to arrive at our opinion. So I just want to show some examples. I know they're very wordy, but I'm just going to highlight some key points. These are all publicly available second-party opinions that we've done, so you can go and find them on our website. And if you're interested, you can go and read the full documents. But in this example, this is a green bond by Han Bank, which I'm sure you guys will be familiar with. And they had a green bond framework that we did an SPO for, and green buildings was one of the various use of proceed categories. But I wanted to show this because this is an example where there's both international certifications cited, so the LEED, BREEAM, EDGE certifications that are used internationally for certifying green buildings. They also refer to a local Mongolian standard. And for building renovations, they have cited this 20% energy savings threshold. So we looked at all of those criteria. In terms of the international certifications, those have various tiers. So we will also look at what tiers are specified as the threshold, because those will have differing levels of requirements on environmental criteria. So in this case, the tiers that were specified are mid-range. They're not right at the top end. And in terms of the 20% energy savings, that is slightly less rigorous than if we look at, let's say, the EU taxonomy, which has a 30% primary energy demand saving requirement for building renovations. But looking at on a holistic level, if we look at the Mongolian context, we understand that there is a nascent green building stock. There's, very extreme temperatures where the building has to have a lot of energy requirements for insulation and heating. So all in all, we still have a positive opinion of this use of proceeds in terms of improving the environmental performance of the built environment in Mongolia. The second example I wanted to share with you was clean transportation. So this is also, another popular category. And I think one reason is also because it has a very clear zero emissions pathway, right? So we have fully electric vehicles, which have zero tailpipe emissions. There are also plug-in hybrid vehicles, which have some level of emissions, but much lower than your traditional internal combustion engine vehicles. So in this case, this is a Chinese issuer. It's a local government financing vehicle. So they basically, get the mandate from the province or the municipality to invest in and execute all sorts of public infrastructure projects. And in this case, they specified the use of proceeds to be used towards zero emission vehicles as well as plug-in hybrids. So for zero emissions, there's clear environmental benefits there, and the associated infrastructure for charging we also would view very positively. In the case of plug-in hybrids, they did not specify a tailpipe emissions threshold. So that is one limitation that we raise here in the fourth point, because if we look at, again, international science-based taxonomies like the EU taxonomy, they have this specification on the tailpipe emission thresholds. So that's just to give you an idea of how we look into detail on UOPs. A third example I'll go through very quickly. I just wanted to show one on climate change adaptation, because like Melissa said, this is one of those that do not receive as much attention, not as popular. So this is a development bank of Kazakhstan. And it has a green and sustainability finance framework. So it has a lot of different green and social UOP categories. And the overarching goal is basically to help the country achieve economic diversification away from resources that are oil-based. So there's a wide range of UOP categories, including climate change adaptation. So here you can see in the company description that they're talking about investments that can improve the climate resiliency of infrastructure, also information support systems like early warning systems. And, it's a more descriptive, high-level kind of eligibility criteria. So our analysis, we describe what we can expect in terms of benefits. So things like helping to improve biodiversity and ensure delivery of ecosystem services. But there's also a comment there on the limitations that we don't have enough information, such as whether there will be climate risk and vulnerability assessments that will be performed. So that is one limitation that we highlight when we assess this UOP. And then now I'll move on to social. So again, these are some of the popular social bond user proceeds categories that we see. And yeah, you can see straight away that, in terms of the thresholds, it's a lot more descriptive. In some cases, we might have very clear quantitative thresholds. I'll show you some examples of affordable housing in a minute. But in a lot of cases, it's it tends to be more on the types of projects and the descriptions of the target populations that are being that the use of proceeds are intended for. And I should clarify that ICMA does say that a general population can also be considered as a target population where valid. But I think in most cases, there is a compelling target population that is described for use of proceeds. So I wanted to show you two examples of affordable housing, just to see, the different approaches to it. So this is from a Colombian financial institution, and this SPO was actually done on their social mortgage bond. And in this case, it's only one category, so 100% of proceeds would be used towards affordable housing. And this Credit Familia, they already have a client base that is very focused on low-income neighborhoods. And in the context of Colombia, housing shortage of adequate and affordable housing, I should say, is very acute. So in this case, we looked at we view very positively that they're addressing this key issue, and there are very clear income threshold criteria that are described elsewhere in the SPO document. But it basically has very clear benefits of improving financial security for low-income households, also obviously improving their living conditions. And that has a lot of later impacts on how it provides more stable conditions for families. It helps to improve educational outcomes for children and youth, et cetera, et cetera. So, if you're interested in a very targeted affordable housing framework, I would encourage you to have a look at this SPO document, because it describes in detail the kinds of mechanisms that are used. And then this is another affordable housing use of proceeds. So it's from, again, from the Guangzhou SPO. And in this case, the way that the income thresholds are set, it's referring to the local government framework. So what we did in our analysis is we looked at the thresholds there and then compared them against some data on the average per capita disposable income in Guangzhou. So, Guangzhou is the capital city of Guangzhou province. It's large city facing a lot of affordable housing issues. And in this case, what the use of proceeds is targeted at is the construction of affordable housing for rent. So it's not for ownership like the Colombian example. And then I think one interesting thing to highlight here is that when you're looking at such a huge market like China, there are a lot of references that you can use, right? So there is the poverty line reference, which is it's a very low amount. So it's 4,000 yuan a year, but that's because it's defined for both rural and urban areas. So, given the stark disparity between rural and urban areas, it's very, very much low in the context of an urban area. So the reference that we chose to use was specifically for Guangzhou. So in this case, it's targeting lower income. It's not, the lowest income, but we would still see that there is a social benefit, a clear social benefit in terms of improving the housing and financial security of the target population. Yeah. I'm going to skip the other example in the interest of time. Now we'll move on to the sustainability-linked bonds and loans. So, Melissa talked a lot about the credibility issues, and it is very challenging, I think, in general, to, or it's rather more complex when we look at UOP versus SLBs. So there are 5 pillars here. The first one is the key performance indicators. And actually, before I go on, just as a recap, sorry. So just as a recap, SLBs are where the funds are used for general corporate purpose. So they're not ring-fenced like the UOP instruments. So that's also why, there are more kind of checks and balances in place in the pillars. So the first one on key performance indicators, the key thing to remember here is that they need to be relevant, core, and material for the issuer's overall business. And this is very, very important because KPIs, they underpin the whole instrument, because the KPI is what you use to set your sustainability performance targets. So a very simple example is GHG emissions is a KPI, and then the target to reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50% by 2030, that would be a SPT. So for the sustainability performance targets, the second pillar here, the key thing there is that it needs to be ambitious. And how do we define ambitious? Basically, we're looking at a material improvement beyond business as usual. And what we would look at in kind of determining whether it's ambitious is comparing to benchmarks where possible. So either an external science-based reference that we can use, depending on the type of SPT. It could also be based on historical performance. So the company would have to provide that historical data for us to be able to assess the level of ambition. And then the third pillar here is the bond characteristics. So this is relating to what Melissa talked about, coupon step up, coupon step down. There are other kinds of mechanisms as well. But here, what we're looking at is basically the financial economic consequences of whether or not a company reaches or achieves its targets in line with the timeline that's been set out. And then the last two pillars are on reporting and verification. So, in this case, the reporting is on a larger scope than on use of proceeds, because for use of proceeds, you're just reporting on the allocation of funds to those eligible projects, right? Whereas here, you're looking at reporting on the company-wide basis, so on the performance of the KPIs, and it's also required that external verification is conducted for that reporting of the performance. And that's really to ensure the credibility because of the financial materiality of that information. And in terms of how our methodology works for this, so again, we've mirrored the ICMA pillars here. And you will see that the first three pillars, KPI, SPTs, and instrument features, those account for the bulk, so 70% of the rating. And a quick overview of popular or commonly seen KPIs that we see. So we did an analysis, or rather Melissa's research team, they did an analysis on SLBs that we've rated so far. And by far, the most popular KPI category is reducing GHG emissions and or expanding renewable energy. And then in terms of drilling down into that KPI category, most of them are focused on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So those are looking at direct emissions or emissions from your direct energy consumption. And then a much lower share is on looking at scope 3 emissions, which we know are much harder to measure and much harder to manage also. And then in terms of looking at the breakdown between absolute and intensity measurements, for scope 3, the majority of KPIs set under scope 3 would be looking at intensity. So depending on the type of sector or industry you are in, a scope 3 intensity KPI could be relevant. Let's say if you're producing internal combustion engine cars, where the use of the car produces emissions. So you want to lower the intensity that results from the use of the product. Whereas, let's say for a more industry where the product itself does not emit, let's say something like apparel production, a scope 3 intensity indicator might not be as relevant, because in the wearing of the clothes does not increase the emissions. So actually increasing your production might decrease the intensity, but not really lead to an improvement, a true improvement in the sense. So the other two KPI categories that I've highlighted here, one is circular economy, and that's looking at reducing the use of raw materials and increasing recycling. And the other one is the social KPI, so that's access and affordability. This one we see some pharma companies take on. So because access to medicine, especially in lower income countries, is a key social issue for the pharmaceutical companies. So I have one example, and I'm sorry it's so wordy, but I actually encourage everyone to go and read this SPO if you're interested in kind of understanding an example. So this is a SLL, so it's a loan, not a bond. It is in the bulk storage and handling sector, so that's part of the energy, transportation, and fuel sector. So what this company does is basically they're a midstream company. They do the storage and handling of fuels. And they had 2 KPIs for this sustainability-linked loan. And I thought it was an interesting example because they have 1 green KPI and 1 social KPI. And it's not often that we see the social KPI included. So in terms of the green KPI, it's looking at the proportion of new capital expenditure that is related to renewable fuel capacity products. So in essence, this company has a business strategy that is looking at reorienting their product mix away from really carbon intensive products like your traditional chemicals, fossil fuels, and flipping those proportions to emphasize on renewable fuels. So things like renewable diesel, biodiesel, sustainable aviation fuels, etc. So that's a very core strategy for the company. And in this case, when we look at the KPI that is directly related to the CAPEX to improve its renewable capacity, that has a very material link to the core business strategy. And so that's why we have a positive view of this KPI. There is one limitation that is highlighted here by the analyst, and that is that setting the KPI on the CAPEX does not necessarily give you certainty on the actual GHG emissions reduction that will result. So that is one limitation that we highlight. But overall, given all these considerations in terms of the business and in terms of the sector, where GHG emissions are a really key factor, our conclusion is that it is a strong KPI. And then the second KPI is looking at supplier diversity. So this is quite an interesting one. There are 2 prongs to it. The first is looking at the proportion of suppliers that they screen using diversity and inclusion criteria. And the second is the actual percentage of new suppliers they onboard that do fulfill the diversity and inclusion criteria. So in this case, it's a midstream company, and actually their supplier pool is much larger than their direct employees. So in the third point here, they mentioned supplier population of over 2,600 compared to its direct employee population of 750. So in that sense, looking at the supply chain is very, we can consider that to be material. And one limitation that is highlighted here is for the second prong, which is looking at the onboarding of diverse suppliers, there's a lack of historical data. So that was a limitation in assessing the strength or the ambition of the related target to this KPI. So I believe that's my last slide. Basically okay, there was some feedback, but I just wanted to share that our full SPO methodology is available on our website, and it has a lot of detail. You can see, at the question level, how we score certain things. So I encourage everyone to go and download and have a look. And then also on our website, you'll be able to find the full documents of those examples that I've showed. So yeah, I'll pause there for any questions.
All right. Thank you so much. Do we have any question for Melissa and Candice? Yeah, I know it's such a lot of information in such a short time, so we need time to process, and a very interesting topic as well, especially our.
Yes, hello.
Yep.
Yeah, yes, Candice, Melissa, thank you. Very interesting, very informative. One quick question. On obviously you did SPO for Hambank in Mongolia and overseas. My question is, what was your overall experience with working with the Mongolian issuer in general, in terms of perhaps regulatory and legal environment in Mongolia for enabling green bonds, the lessons that Mongolian issuers could learn going forward, and as well as the Mongolian regulators and other market participants in terms of future successful green bond issuances?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So it was a very positive experience. Actually, for us, the first version of the framework we received was already in a very good shape, because sometimes we receive frameworks that are still very much under development. In the case of Hambank, they already had a very clear idea of the kinds of use of proceeds categories that they wanted to fund, and then there was quite detailed eligibility criteria. And then in terms of the governance processes, it was also, they had already established structures in place that they could cite. So things like their exclusion practices, like their governance committees and the expertise they have in green bonds and green finance, it was already in place there. So, and I think another interesting point about working with Hambank is that it was the first time we looked at the Mongolian taxonomy. So I think that was also a very helpful reference for us to understand in terms of the Mongolian context, what are the kinds of activities that are quote unquote, approved or prioritized in terms of Mongolia's sustainable development. And I think the Mongolian taxonomy is also quite clearly set out that it allowed us to compare relevant criteria with other taxonomies, like maybe CBI or the EU taxonomy. So I think overall it was a very, very positive experience. I know there's quite a lot of interest in Mongolia in general. We participated in one of the Hambank conferences as well, where they're trying to encourage more green, social, sustainable bond issuances. So I think we would definitely welcome any further interest from Mongolian issuers. I think it's a very interesting market, and there's actually, a lot of supporting mechanisms that have been put in place to encourage this development of sustainable finance.
All right, is there any more questions? Going once, twice, and that's it. All right, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We appreciate the detailed information on sustainable finance provided by our presenters from Sustainable Fitch. We look forward to more collaborations with Sustainable Fitch in the future. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Nutriment.